So, welcome back to Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And this week we're talking about military mindset. That means that what we're going to cover off is really the differences between the thinking processes, the beliefs, the values, and the assumptions that happen within a military environment compared to a civilian environment. Do you think that's a fair assessment in terms of what we're going to talk about today, Rich?
We are indeed. Yeah.
So I thought we'd jump right in, because this is where one of those sessions, these episodes where I get to ask you questions for a change. In terms of how you think people would view military mindset compared to civilian mindset, if you were able to give me a definition of what you think the differences are, or what people assume we're talking about when we mention military mindset, what would you think that would be?
Right, well, there's the obvious stereotypes, but I'll just cover the military aspect and what that is first off. So people in military, we kind of have a common bond together, because even though it might be different units and say logistics, parachutists, infantry, Marines, sailors, you name it, we've all got sort of like a common bond of going through quite a harsh training or hard training, and then extends on beyond that in certain circumstances. So for argument's sake, you've got the paratroopers, the airborne fraternity, as they like to call themselves, or the airborne brotherhood. And no matter where in the world they are, and they're with the other airborne people, they would always have that common bond of jumping out of aircraft, which is a silly, yeah, a bit daft anyway, I think. Why get a perfectly good airplane? So they've all got that. So they have that common bond all across, and it doesn't matter where, as I say, it doesn't matter where in the world they are. There's that bond, and that goes across pretty much everybody in military, because we have a similar understanding of not necessarily what their training was in, say, the States or Canada, but we have an understanding of what they do, and we can easily relate to one another. So then, civilian-wise, what I've come across is that civilians can think we're all traumatized, we're all psychopaths, we're all lunatics, we're all robotic, we all don't think for ourselves, we have no imagination, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. There's another extreme of things is we're all baby kidders, we're all murderers, we're all this, that, and the other, and we all do horrible shit. But that is what some people perceive us.
Do you think that's because there's a much wider aspect in terms of the kind of activities that the military get involved in, that sometimes, while it might be in the public eye, it's not necessarily always as noticed, maybe?
Yeah. So there isn't that many people now in forces compared to what it was years ago. So that link is kind of missing, because all the counties used to have their regiment and county. So mine would be the Gloucesters, then there would be like the Duke of York's, Somerset Light Infantry, etc., etc. So everybody had that common bond within the county, and they would know pretty much people who would go off to join a unit. And that's kind of been lost now. So what people don't see within, or the civilian, as you say, looking at places like York, where they do the floods and flood prevention, they would go out and help civilian emergency services, providing cover for that and help protect and build up the barriers and sandbagging for that. Then there is, like a good few years ago, is helping on fireman strikes, going out operating the Green Goddesses. There's a foot and mouth thing going on, burning, yeah, all the funeral pyres of all the cattle and all that, because of foot and mouth. And then on the extreme side of things is like I think it was in the Philippines, where they had a hurricane. So the United States sent out their aircraft carriers. So they're basically floating the city. They've got hospitals, they've got water purification and all that sort of stuff to go and help out that civilian population. Whereas some people go, what are you sending out? What are you sending military equipment out to go and do that sort of stuff? We're not seeing the actual picture of what help it is providing.
So in relation to that, then there's a whole element of, I suppose, peacekeeping, emergency response, and disaster relief that people sometimes maybe aren't quite as aware of, because the focus instead is on combat.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example. I won't name any names. There was a lady who I did a workshop with, and due to her age and everything else about her, her father taught her to be a pacifist because of what he'd actually done during the Second World War. And it wasn't until she went off to do some work with the American forces that she said, "Oh, this is kind of what it's about." And a penny dropped for her. And she said, "If I was younger, I'd have joined up and gone off and done all this."
Because of that aspect that sometimes is possibly, while it's there and it's visible, it's not necessarily as noticed.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of that military thinking, part and parcel of that, my understanding of that is the core principles that sit behind that, because those are the ones that really inform the behaviours and the expectations that any member of the military has of themselves and of each other. So shall we quickly run through those, Rich, in terms of those ones? So I think the first one was what? Courage? Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, courage. So they say we have two aspects of courage. The courage is what a lot of people think about is like the VC winners, Medal of Honor people, military cross. They're the guys and gals who've gone out, done something extraordinary on a battlefield, and that sort of bravery and that sort of courage. When there's actually moral courage. And the best example I can give that, I think off the top of my head, I can't remember the gentleman's name. He was out in Vietnam during the My Lai massacre. He brought his helicopters down and he stopped all these men from killing the civilian population. So he had the moral courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong. And if you do shoot on these villagers and these folk, my men will shoot you." It's believed, they know he saved X amount, but because of the length of the operation, it's believed he saved about 20,000 people's lives.
So that's almost about having the courage of the convictions and the courage of the ethical value system that sits behind that, of that sense of right and wrong.
Absolutely, yeah.
And standing up for that.
Standing up for what is right and wrong.
So there's an element in there which also is about putting aside almost your priority for personal safety. But I don't want to necessarily go into that just now, because I think that's part of the conversation we're probably going to have later on. So if you're okay with that, I'm going to park that one, but I'm going to come back to it.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that one, because I think it's really important that we understand that part too. So the next one in terms of the principles are discipline. Just tell me about discipline.
Again, so that is personal discipline, so self-discipline, get up in the morning, being on parade at the right time, keeping yourself fit, healthy, clean, tidy, keeping your kit clean and tidy, and all that kind of basic stuff, as well as then being able to be disciplined on the battlefield or disciplined on exercise or whatever you're doing by, again, looking after yourself, looking after your teammates, making sure that in something again like the My Lai massacre is going to happen, because that was a lack of discipline within that unit to go off and look at massacring all these unfortunate folk.
Does that also, would it be safe to say that if I took the word discipline and redefined it as having standards which you all universally will uphold and stand by?
In the vast majority of cases, yeah.
Yeah. So what about respect for others?
Respect for others, eh? There is the obvious banter, in the old dark humor and just ribbing people, because why not? It's just funny. And then there's respect for others. I'm sure other people who've served will back me up on this. It doesn't matter breed, background, culture, pretty much. Everybody's gone through that system, and we're all there for one another. It's that buddy system, that looking after each other. And that's all that really matters, is who's next to you in that shell scrape, who's next to you in that fire team, who's going to help you out.
Yeah, because I think certainly from the work that I've been fortunate enough to do with veterans, what's very clear is definitely the banter, which always makes me smile and I thoroughly enjoy. But underlying that, there's a level of courtesy and a level of respect, which is very prevalent and very, very obvious to see in terms of interactions, and that's very clear in terms of my experiences within that too. So what about integrity?
Yes, well, if you haven't got, I suppose another word is honesty, isn't it? If you can be honest with yourself and you can be honest with your teammates, then that's putting people's lives at risk. So my understanding is, anthropologically, our anthropologists have studied ancient tribes, and so ancient tribes had no more than roughly 120 people, and that's the same size as platoon company. Company. So what they would do is, if somebody had lied about food source they had, and the tribe was starving, and they were lying about that they had this food source, they would kill that person because they're a liability to the tribe, because the whole tribe's own lives are at risk. Now, so if you haven't got that integrity, that's potentially you putting all these other people's lives at risk without owning up to certain things and doing the right thing.
So is that almost linking back into courage and having the courage of your convictions and the courage in knowing what's right and being honest with yourself and with others?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next one I wanted to talk to you about was loyalty, because I think this is where the conversation we're having starts to get really interesting. So give me a brief overview of loyalty, because I think this is where we're going to go a wee bit deeper in this one.
Yeah. So we have loyalty is to your teammate, your oppo, then the fire team, then the section, then the platoon, then the company, then the battalion. And then ultimately the loyalty is to that unit. So then where's loyalty? If we're transitioning back into civilian street and we need to go and get, say, like our transition courses done for whatever career or whatever trade skill we're looking at going into, where's that loyalty then to yourself to go, I need time off to go and do this. I need time off to go and do that.
Well, I suppose that's the part where I want to go a little bit deeper in that one. So in terms of the military training, the military approach and what's encouraged, where is it the priority that loyalty sits?
Well, I'll give you an example. There's a friend of mine, and he was leaving about the same time I was. The nature of his job, he believed that he was not able to get away to complete his resettlement training, what he wanted to do, and as well as go and look at housing and stuff. So when it came to him leaving on his day, he was like, oh, I've got nowhere to live. Fortunately, the military allowed him to stay on for a bit longer, and he was able to get some council housing. So he'd spent all that time being loyal to the unit, but then he hadn't had that loyalty to himself. And I know we're going to touch on this later, but it's all about boundaries and boundary setting where you ought to have been going, do you know what, this is my time now. I've done all that.
Well, since you've raised that, because the next one we were going to look at was selfless commitment, but I kind of want to wrap that in with loyalty, because I think there's a really strong link there that I want to kind of get to, which is, I suppose, the key behaviours and the priority in your thinking in terms of who you're responsible for within that unit. So in terms of selfless commitment, what does that translate to?
Selfless commitment translate to, on the extreme end of things, is giving your life to somebody else, your other teammates.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of things is doing all that work, not setting boundaries yourself, would be, say, like planning an exercise, planning a range day, being there until whatever time in the morning, getting all that stuff ready and going, what am I still doing here? Yeah. People are expecting people in the forces to, or that we have an expectation to go above and beyond of what possibly in civilian street would go, this is not acceptable. I'm not paid for this. I can come back and do that tomorrow.
From what I've certainly come across and worked with, it seems like that actually serves a very valid purpose in a military setting.
Yeah.
So
it has to. Because if we don't have that commitment, that selfless commitment, then, you know, who are we going to go, well, screw you, I'm not helping you out. So in a lot of cases, we got to have a way to go and help our oppos out. You know, they're struggling with something. You know, they just may need that hand up before going out on a tab or an exercise, and they're absolutely hanging out and they can't get up, and they got you go, give us your hand, mate, put you up.
So is that also not about, I suppose, the combat situations as well? In terms of that combat situation or when you're on tour, who are you responsible for? What's your principal responsibility?
Is to the self and ultimately to whoever is around you're working with.
Because I don't know if I've often heard people almost talk about the fact that within that loyalty and that selfless commitment, there's that belief that actually my job is to bring the person next to me home safely.
Yeah.
Not me, them.
Yeah.
Because there's the reciprocation and the faith and the trust that their job is to bring you home safe.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I can see how that is really effective and essential in terms of that whole structure. But I can also see how that might give quite some significant challenges when you leave the military, if that belief in that behaviour set is still there. Because in terms of personal boundaries, whose boundaries in that belief structure are you safeguarding? Is it yours or is it the person next to you?
It's someone else's, and they're safeguarding your boundaries.
So when you switch from military to civilian, who safeguards your boundaries then?
No one, because we haven't as such.
And whose boundaries are you still safeguarding?
Well, it'd be whatever career path that somebody goes down to. So they'll be going, oh, we're going to help this guy out, going to help that guy out, or last. And that may not be the most effective way of going about things.
So does that then translate almost to that sense of I'm responsible for everybody and for their welfare? And in a military setting, that would work well because everybody else is also responsible for you.
Yeah.
But what happens in a civilian setting when you are not surrounded by people who are taking responsibility for you?
Crisis.
I can imagine that can be quite stressful.
Very much so, yeah. The whole shape of things is just gone. And you're like, where am I now? It's kind of like the old ship at sea without rudder.
So I tend to see some quite common behaviour patterns when I'm working with people that are experiencing that transition shock almost. Now I'm going to use the word shock because I think there is almost that shock to the system, shock to the thinking, shock to the values and beliefs. And some of the things that I see a lot is almost that overstretching and overcommitting of responsibility, and the over extension to the point of, and I'm going to use this word very carefully because a lot of people will see the word I'm going to use next in one context, and I'm going to ask for a bit of leeway to explain it. What I see is a lot of overextension to the point of self-harm. And when I reference self-harm, I'm talking about detriment to the individual's own mental well-being in terms of the level of stress, level of responsibility, the anxiety levels that can be associated with that, because their existing military mindset is telling them that they are still responsible for absolutely everybody in their vicinity, but nobody is responsible for them.
Yeah, well, added on top of all that kind of thing is it's the simple things that most civilians would take for granted is, how do I find a dentist? How do I find a doctor? Council tax. And where all these, unless if somebody's been married, then it's a little bit different in some circumstances, they're already paying the bills. But pretty much all bills are taken out of wages at source. So you obviously have to pay for accommodation. You used to have to pay for food. Whether they bring that back in or not, I don't know. But we don't have that kind of level of responsibility of, oh, where's the local dentist?
So if you've been in the military for
since 18, say
18, and 20 years later you leave, for most of us at the ages of 18, 19, as we start to kind of gain a bit more independence, that's when we're learning the basics of, you know, how to register at the GP, where the local dentist is, the fact that, you know, council tax is a regular occurrence in most people's lives, and how to do all of those elements, because that's part and parcel of finding your first accommodation, moving out, spreading your wings and getting a bit more independent. I can imagine if that all hits you in one fell swoop at a much later date, where you've had a very structured and very contained community, that must be quite a bit of a culture shock.
Yeah. Again,
as the job change, the career change.
It is for a lot of people, they are getting that rudderless ship at sea. Where am I headed? What direction do I need to get into? And without the rudder, you can't go anywhere.
So does that also then have an impact in terms of, because what we're talking about here is, we've touched on that mindset piece, which is about who looks after my boundaries, and where is my sense of focus in terms of who and what I am responsible for. And in relation to the military, that tends to be, it's very externalized, not internalized. Civilian life, it's very internalized. I'm responsible for myself. In terms of community structure, that's all provided within the military, but you leave that, you transition out, and you now have the task of creating all of those elements on your own.
Yeah.
As well as career change, location change. So you might be moving house, changing job, all of that, as well as the things that you're now having to learn for the first time because you've not needed this before, because there have been other things that you've had to do instead. And then the part that's on top of that I wanted to touch on is, I suppose, the difference between black and white thinking and shades of grey.
Yep.
Because In terms of the structure within the military, and this is where, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would assume that actually direction, action, task, how that looks like an outcome are pretty black and white.
Mm-hmm. We get given a set of orders to say go and take a village or whatever that objective is. So you get given the orders, you get given the plan, and it's up to the team leader to go and then work it out how they're going to do it. What's that story like of how they're going to get there and all that kind of thing. But within that, there's all that structure of this is the times we're going out. This is what we're going to do before we go out. This is the kit that we're carrying, and expanding on that story as we go, approaching more and more that time to that objective.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is very black and white.
So whether that's filling sandbags for flood defences or going into combat situation, actually the actions you take in each of those situations is very clearly defined.
Yeah, they are, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some situations where you go, oh, we weren't expecting that. So there are grey areas that do crop up.
There'll be variables within it.
Yeah. But there is a structured plan as to how to get to that objective or how to beat that task.
So even with those variables, though, I would anticipate that there's probably guidelines on how to respond to those variables.
So you've got standard operating procedures.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows what to do, what actions on when X happens or when Y happens.
So how grey are those variables really?
There may be a black swan here and there, but not really, no.
So is it safe to say that even the variables tend to be fairly, they might be unexpected, or they might be, rather than unexpected, they might be not what your goal or planned expectation is, but there is a contingency already in place for that.
Yeah, they're not planned for.
Yeah. But there is a raft of contingencies that you
there's a whole host of contingencies.
Yeah, okay. In terms of that shades of grey then in civilian life, how clear are the objectives, the outcomes, the task delivery?
No, are you talking about work or are you talking about in general civilian life?
A bit of both.
Bit of both. Well,
go for work first.
Go for work. Some things in that can be clearly defined, because if you don't have clearly defined structure and how to do a job, then it won't get done correctly. Agree? But there may not be, but then you'll have an end objective, what you want to achieve within that task, whatever that task is, that project. But how, because somebody must have done something similar somewhere else, you can borrow that plan and work it out, surely.
Well, there is, but I'm going to overlay an extra layer of complexity to that in that consideration of the grey. And that's the fact that you don't have other people round about you with a military mindset.
Yeah.
Because my challenge would be whether or not you having a military mindset where do you then feel as though the responsibility to drive that plan forward or to deliver that then sits? Is it more likely that that's going to feel as though that should be yours in a civilian situation because nobody else is necessarily, or you're not seeing as much structure or as much action taking or maybe as much direction as you are possibly used to from everybody around about you?
Yeah. But would that depend on how good the team actually is that you're working with in civilian street?
Quite possibly, yes.
But
I'm just wondering where that sits in terms of that selfless commitment and that loyalty piece then, because that comes back to what the impact this is on terms of whose boundaries you safeguard. And if you are not safeguarding your own in those situations and nobody's safeguarding yours, but you are safeguarding everybody else's, then what behaviours are you then at risk of having?
Yeah. Getting burnt out, getting bored out, overextending yourself in some way, maybe encroaching on somebody else's work, turning up far too early at work to carry on doing that job and then staying too late at night to do that job.
So that comes back to that concept of risk, of placing yourself at risk of self-harm, because actually you don't have the same approach to your own boundaries as everybody else does.
Yeah.
In terms of that military mindset then, we've touched on kind of the bond and the importance, I suppose, of that shift in boundary ownership, which within the military is critical and is probably fairly central in terms of making sure everybody comes home safely.
Yep.
But actually, it doesn't really translate very well to civilian life then. There's a significant risk if that belief system is still what's prevalent in the individual in a civilian lifestyle. Do you think part and parcel of that, though, is also about that sense of self and sense of value in terms of self? Because my understanding of what I'm seeing if you're looking after somebody else's boundaries rather than your own, there's almost like an implication that they are more important than I am.
Yeah.
Which then comes down to that almost that risk of an understanding of the value of self, which is a key part of our personal identity. Because the other element that probably I wanted to touch on with you is that sense of purpose.
Which is something that a lot of folks that do leave the forces lose. Something common I noticed is that, for argument's sake, everybody was going, right, oh, what should we do this year? We'll all go into data comms and fibre optics. Our next one would be maritime security or close protection. And then it will be cyber security. Then it'll be kind of like following the herd one after the other. Because if somebody else is doing it, it must be a good thing for me to do, and go realise after maybe 18 months or so, oh, this is really crap, isn't it? This is not what I want to be doing. So they've not set their own boundaries or really thought the process out of what do I want to do next. It's probably more a case of what don't I want to be doing? I don't want to be in the military anymore. It's not a case of what do I really want to do? But that might take 5, 8, 10 years after you leave, after somebody leaves, to actually find out what they really want to do. Because the whole process of going, re-identifying as to whom you want to become, resetting those boundaries, re-looking at, I suppose, breaking that mold and restructuring the life that you want to live.
Well, I suppose if I look at myself, while I haven't got military experience, actually, I'm on my third career path. And that's not necessarily that unusual these days. But that means that I've practiced that all the way through my adult years. This isn't the first time that I'll have gone through that I've had a chance to kind of be a bit of a career butterfly, to move from purpose to purpose, to try different purposes and goals on and see what fits. Because it strikes me that actually a big part of that sense of self is that sense of purpose, particularly given, I suppose, the structure of the military. I would suggest that probably that sense of purpose that the military gives people probably actually attracts a certain type of individual to that as well.
Possibly, yeah.
And therefore, that becomes almost part of our inner picture of ourselves, our inner portrait. You know, when we look internally and say, this is who I am, that purpose is part of that picture.
In some ways, but to a greater, lesser extent, is people can choose pathways within the forces, but we're still in that structure. So somebody might go from, argument's sake, like a friend of mine used to be in the artillery, then he went into the PT Corps. But within that job, he's had several different career paths, but still within the military.
Well, you know how we were talking earlier on about the extent of the military networks, the fact that part and parcel of the strength of the military bond is both the strength of the serving community and also the strength of the veteran community. So I'm going to ask you then, in terms of that veteran community, I get a strong sense that for most military veterans, if I was to ask them to picture themselves internally, they would in some part still be wearing part of their uniform.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, I know with myself and at least one other person, so whether it's a common thing or not, I don't know. But when we left, we never wanted to have anything to do with the military. We wanted that side of us killed off. But because we've been in there so long, or we've done all this, that, and the other, it's such a part of us. You can't get rid of that part of the identity. It'll always be there.
And I suppose that comes back to that inner portrait that we carry of ourselves.
Yeah.
So, you know, a classic example could be, if I take it away from that military civilian debate and just talk about, for instance, things like sometimes the struggle that smokers have in giving up smoking is the fact that part of their internal portrait, they will be somewhere holding that cigarette, that pipe, that cigar. And actually part and parcel of that change is taking that part of that picture and removing or altering it so that that cigarette, that pipe, that cigar is no longer part of their internal portrait. So if you're still having that portrait, part and parcel of that transition is actually almost altering that portrait to give you a new sense of self, to give you that understanding of actually what is my purpose going forward, because purpose has been really important in the first place.
Yeah, where's that internal conflict of who am I next and what do I do with this aspect of me and where do I bring this new aspect of me in?
And is this also about how I define value?
Yeah. Then how do I reevaluate myself?
That seems like there's a huge amount in terms of that transition piece.
It is. And I don't know whether they can or what they're going to do is possibly because then I know there's a lot of guys and gals now who are, even in their few years, they're already going to the careers shows and careers fairs because they're already going, what do I do afterwards? Who am I next? What are my options? Whereas it was when I was serving this case of, you're going to stay in and that's it. You'll be that for life. There's no other option.
But I suppose in terms of that transition piece, my understanding is that there is time given for retraining, there's funding there.
There is, yeah.
But my question would be whether or not there's enough done about that identity piece.
As far as I can recall, whether they've changed it or not, it's been almost 10 years now. There's none.
So is that where almost there's a question to everybody listening then to say, actually, what's your views in terms of the importance of that identity piece? And whether you are about to leave the military and transition it, or whether you transitioned it a while ago, actually, what was the impact in terms of that identity, of your sense of identity? And what were the challenges that led to? How did you maybe meet those challenges, address those, and overcome them? And what would have been helpful for you in that transition?
Yeah, what would have been helpful is support. It is not getting, I won't go into details, but not getting fobbed off by a charity and feeling like, what was that all about? So there's a sense of betrayal, a sense of loss within that itself. Going, yeah, basically, there's a card. Ring me when you're desperate, and I'll get back to you.
Is that maybe because there's an awful lot of different providers, but maybe the network, while it's very well, the network is very well provided, it's not necessarily as joined up or as
No, I won't go into details, Ali,
integrated
because
maybe as it could be in terms of how all of those services then link together.
no, it was just one particular bloke,
Okay.
and I won't go into details
No.
because no.
So if we then move that on to, we've talked about kind of, I suppose, that sense of identity, that sense of purpose. We've talked about the boundaries piece in terms of that being very different from the civilian understanding of boundaries. Because again, I suppose my query would be whether or not MD has experienced actually the impact of how they've gone about reshaping those boundaries. Because I certainly know from work that you and I do, Rich, that a huge amount of the conversations we're having with veterans revolves around boundaries, revolves around encouraging them and helping them almost put them in place for the first time. So these are personal boundaries, not boundaries that they're safeguarding for others, but they're safeguarding for self. And before we kind of close it and bring the conversation from today to a close, I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you think would be worth adding to that conversation we've had today.
Yeah.
Because maybe if I summarize,
The question is, if you're going to look after yourself, who's going to look after you?
and I think that's an important one to ask. And it's part, I suppose it's central to that change and that shift, isn't it? And that transition is that understanding of actually, that's almost kind of the central pivotal change that you need to make, which is putting yourself first, safeguarding self first before you safeguard anybody else. So in terms of today then, that means we've covered quite a bit. We've had a look at, I suppose, the central principles. In terms of how the military community goes about building that defined and really powerful set of behaviours which keeps people safe, that keeps people effective and efficient, that helps ensure that what needs to happen does happen. But we've also looked at how those are really quite fundamentally different in terms of ownership of responsibility between, and whether that sits as your responsibilities for self or for others.
Yeah, we've also covered is generalized perceptions of how potential civilians can see veterans and wider military community as well.
Yeah.
And obviously the principles or the values and standards of the army and how they apply to people in the military. And there's obviously a crossover with people who are civilians anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's been a good chat, Ali.
Mm-hmm. So on that note then, I think that's us. We're going to close the session and the episode for this week. But again, the invite is always open. If anybody's got any comments or anything that they think they would like to engage in the conversation with, or maybe have us do a bit of a deeper dive on, because certainly, you know, we probably share a mutual fascination for that personal boundaries piece and the importance of it in terms of people's experiences and mental well-being. So yeah.
Yeah. So you can find us on YouTube at Rethinking Trauma and Transition. You can find us on Amazon Music and Spotify, Anchor, and maybe a couple of other podcasts.
Yeah.
And please, if you can, leave us reviews as well.
Yeah, you can find us on Facebook as well. We have our Facebook page and we're also on LinkedIn.
We are under Rethinking Trauma and Transition.
Yeah.
We look forward to hearing from you.
Take care and good night.
Good night.